in my experience, for example, in the anti-war movement, against Vietnam, we have to remember that before we're going to see any cracks in the onslaught, the vomiting of lying media coverage, distortions of fact, before we're going to start seeing any of these politicians starting to get a backbone and speaking out against the war, we have to build a massive movement that makes the rulers, or at least some of them, consider that they're going to have to pay a political price for their policies, which becomes counterproductive to their overall relationship of forces that they want to maintain. We are a long way from reaching that point yet, but look how many of us are here, which is a huge step forward for expanding our movement, we hope, coming out of this. So we want to urge you all, as part of getting involved, to look at our mission statement. We spent hours arguing and discussing with each other what this would say. Went through a lot of drafts, but we're very proud of it, and we think it's a basis for a good unity of action that avoids some of the pitfalls of things that the government and others want us to see be divided about because of their red baiting and so forth. When you leave tonight, if you can see your way to sparing a few dollars to help finance our work, we would really appreciate it. Somebody's going to be at the door with a hat, I hope, and just ask for your donations, because a serious movement has to finance its own work. South Florida Progressive Jewish Action, so those were some unfortunate omissions. So now, to our next speaker, if I can get my computer to work right. It's very instructive to me. Washington has increasingly used Cuba as a whipping boy in expanding their campaign to stage a coup in Venezuela. You know, especially after the fiasco of February 23rd, they're casting about, as Sandy said, for other parts of the information war. And of course, Cuba has been a whipping boy of Washington for a long time. Many people in this room are veterans here in Miami of standing up for Cuba's right to determine its fate for many years, when the climate here in the city was much more hostile than anything we're seeing out of Doral about the defense of the Cuban Revolution. And the fact is, and we know this just from our own political work and from the 1,000 leaflets we handed out on this campus in the last 2 days to build this meeting, that many young Cubans are rapidly shifting thetheir views about the Cuban Revolution, and there's a big generation gap between the die-hard oldsters of the Brigade 2506 that met at the Biltmore with Bolton, and the younger Cubans going to school at FIU, working sweatshop jobs at the airport or in garment factories or whatever here in Miami. Trump and Bolton and Pence are out of touch with this, which is one of the dangers you always have when you start believing your own propaganda. So when we were discussing at one of our coalition meetings who would speak at this meeting, one of our members, Yadira Escobar, who's over here, will be speaking next, immediately insisted that she be added to the platform to defend her Cuban homeland against the war makers' slanders. Yadira has been a serious and disciplined activist in the work of our coalition, as well as speaking out, listen to this, on her YouTube channel, which is Yadira Escobar, her blog, her website, and a radio program. So we're very proud to give you a chance to hear her for yourself, and to welcome her family, which is also very active in this. So our next speaker, Yadira Escobar.
No, I think I'd rather stand. Okay. I've been sitting there for so long. Well, anyways, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, especially considering the topic, which is naturally for almost a whole decade now been a huge obsession of mine. And it's because places like this one right now, this little event that we're having with so little of us, but you know, it's something in Miami, are just so rare that motivates you. You see, they try to, like, ever since a little voice out there in Miami shows up and says, I'm gonna be a rebel, I'm gonna think for myself, and I'm gonna defend the poor people of the world, the poor people in Cuba that are the ones that suffer the embargo and the sanctions, not the ruling elite, it's the people that suffer the sanctions. But then they try to link you to the government when that's not true. Just because we have a dissident voice here does not mean that we have any connections to the government, which is kind of like ironic, because You hear Marco Rubio, Trump always talk about the dissidency that is oppressed in Venezuela and Cuba. Well, what about Miami's dissidents, right? Miami doesn't have any criticism, right? Here we're all super happy and we have to be super complacent and just suck up and just drown all of our complaints. Well, one of the things that I really, really had to speak up against is the constant slander that they just shoot at Cuba. See, it's not enough to already warm up the war machinery to go against Venezuela. They have to mention Cuba. They have to create these fantastical stories about, like, let's say, this mythological Cuban intelligence official that does everything. I'm surprised they don't even do constructions, because they say, oh, they're torturing the dissidents in Venezuela. And then say, they're propping up Maduro. They're doing this other thing. And I just think, why can't Venezuelans do anything for themselves? I mean, I'm pretty sure that if Venezuelans wanted to repress their people, they could do that. You don't need to ship off a Cuban official that takes years of preparation and just tarnish your image, because obviously Washington D.C. is going to use it against you, to just repress people, to torture dissidents, really? That makes absolutely no sense. But I think that this hostility goes way back to the origins of what it is to have, their alliance, their their English-speaking alliance against a Hispanic Latino alliance. Because that attitude that John Bolton displayed yesterday at the Biltmore Hotel, surrounded by people that I can't believe they're Cuban. You heard comments about these people saying, oh, I'd rather go in and do another Bay of Pigs. You do know the Bay of Pigs was a fiasco, right? You do read history, right? It failed. It doesn't work. Imperialism, whether it's a la French, a la German, or a la American, it just doesn't work. Because even if you do these little, you let the natives govern themselves, or you try to assimilate them, making them all believe they're going to be French citizens, but in reality it doesn't work out that way, because there will always be racism. It doesn't matter. Every time you invade somebody, whether it's through drones, cultural hegemony, whatever it is, people will react, because that's when they realize, wait a minute, I am not you. I don't want to follow your customs. And Bolton, when he yesterday declared that the Monroe Doctrine, it's alive and well, I'm just thinking, does he really know what it means? Do you realize how damaging that is to America's reputation? Because right now, America is becoming a laughingstock outside of our little bubble. It's like Trump wants to, I like nationalism, and I think nationalism can cure people of whatever imperialistic force is trying to take away their local culture. But the type of nationalism that we're kind of like creating here in America, that doesn't work. You have to listen to what people are saying outside. And right now they're saying that we are losing the cultural, military, financial wars, because the tightening of the sanctions that Bolton announced yesterday, which I'm so glad was yesterday, so that then we can criticize it today on this Thursday. Everything that he said not only harms the civilian population of Cuba and Venezuela, but also their partners like Canada, because Canada is super upset about this. The European Union, Spain itself, Spain has a lot of businesses in Cuba. They don't want this, because it's like America, the current administration right now, all that they're doing is distributing sanctions. I don't like you, I'm going to sanction you, I'm going to punish you, I'm going to treat you all like children, because, we've got this American exceptionalism and all that. But in reality, it's creating an isolationism in the United States, because then this administration has totally lost touch with what is happening in the outside world. And Cubans don't need, these mythological Cuban officials, they don't need to go incite rebellion in Venezuela. Venezuelans have been doing it for years. I don't think a Cuban official, went down to incite Bolivar. Well, Simon Bolivar did not need a Cuban to go, hey, how about you try and be a little independent? It doesn't work like that. But this, like I said at the beginning, this goes way back, because, I did write myself some notes, but usually I just get carried away and just start talking nonstop. But, see, just as Cuba was about to win its war of independence, Roosevelt went down and did his little symbolic thing in Santiago de Cuba, and they totally humiliated the general of the
the Cuban Liberation Army, and he was so embarrassed that when the U.S. Army came down and they just took the city of Santiago, which was the last victory that we needed. Cubans had already given up hundreds of thousands of Cuban youths. A family member of mine, an ancestor, he bled for Cuba. So it just tells you that everybody lost their young sons and daughters in that war of independence. But then when they realized that victory was so close at hand, they just went down to steal it from us. And then they humiliate Calixto Garcia so much that he ends up resigning, because he says that he found out that Santiago was eventually won through some dude. They didn't even bother to talk to him. Because it's what I was saying about that attitude, that elitist, arrogant attitude of thinking that, well, if you fall outside of these countries, if you're not part of the Five Eyes, if you're not United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, and Australia, you're just some third world country full of natives. Like, you don't count. And that's not true, because as we can rightfully see, Cuba has resisted. Because right now, the hostility against Venezuela is focusing on one thing. They believe, a lot of people, left or right, they believe that the Bolivarian Revolution is still very green, that they haven't been able to mature, and that if you punish them, just if you hurt them in the right way, make medicine hard to get, make food impossible, have people go down to barter, like if we were in some, barter town, like, the Mad Max movie, people bartering stuff. I don't deny that there are shortages in Venezuela. It's more than obvious. Some of our members in the Hands Up Venezuela coalition have said that, maybe there is a humanitarian crisis, but just because there is a crisis, it does not mean that gives you the right to invade, because they're just like preparing the battleground, the atmospheres. Not everybody has the chance. Some people work for a living. Not everybody has a chance to do their own research and be enlightened by the actual facts. Most people just hear from their friends. They'll check up on social media, and what they're trying to do basically is take advantage of the fact that the Venezuelan Revolution for a long time relied on a very nice prosperity, like Sandy was saying, that they would just, the government, the Bolivarian Chavez, he would just give out TV sets, refrigerators, healthcare, because now they're saying that that these social programs are failing. That's not true. I've talked to Venezuelans. Yes, I may not be a Venezuelan, because apparently some people believe that they insist that if you're not Venezuelan, you have no right to speak about Venezuelan, like we can't have an opinion. Journalism wouldn't exist. And I don't think Trump ever visited Venezuela. I don't think that Trump, Marco Rubio, Pompeo, Bolton are Venezuelans. Yet they have an opinion. Nobody's stopping them from saying they're garbage, right? So when they look at Venezuela, they say, if you torture them in just the right way, they will collapse, because they're not like the Cuban Revolution. Because in Cuba, there are many complaints, and within the left, there are many demands for a more democratic approach to find solution to these new sanctions. But whatever small criticism might be naturally forming within Cuba throughout the decades, Cuba definitely is stronger in this. Cuba's like a veteran in resisting imperialism. Cuba has survived decades of this. So Cuba, rightfully so, is advising the Bolivarian Revolution on how to survive. It's just an exchange of advice, of knowledge. It's like somebody who's just chock full of gray hairs and saying, you have to listen to me. Like, you want to do this. Which is why I just found it absolutely ridiculous and absurd how you hear reports about people that, supposedly ex-military guys that defect, and then they come here, they want a political asylum, so they start telling these stories about how Cuban military men dressed as civilians. That I'm going to get to that, because that's why I wrote so many notes. But it is such a bombardment of slander that there's so much to talk about on this. But when they say, like, if it's a horror story, that Cuban officials are helping Venezuelans with the construction of tunnels for surviving a possible military intervention from the United States, that's totally legitimate. Everybody has the absolute right to defend themselves. But, they don't export democracy, because it's more like, I'm going to be a Washington, D.C., you people are going to be my subjects. The essence of the Monroe Doctrine is about. And And like I said, it's just like an alliance of what Noam Chomsky rightfully calls I wrote it down, but I can't find the page right now. The ultra-nationalist reactionary internationals, because they say that Cuba is like exporting all these values when that's not true. Right now, Cuba, in order to survive the crippling sanctions, which cost Cuba, it's like a rough estimate that it's around $12 million daily. I'm thinking that you could really make socialism look great with that kind of money. Not saying that in hands of Venezuela everybody's a communist, but I'm just saying that it's really retarded and stupid and manipulative when you hear the comment that socialism doesn't work, and then when you try to look for examples of socialism trying to work, you find that it's always sanctioned and it's meant that you can't ever see what it's really about. But again, this isn't about socialism, it's about Cuba. But the thing is that, and just to wrap it up, because I don't want to talk too much, because the room is actually going to be, taken away eventually. But yes, but the sanctions is that in Cuba right now, the sanctions have hurt only the civilian population, and that's what's happening in Venezuela as well. But when they speak about all these, when they slander basically Cuba's presence, I say that it promotes xenophobia, because if you say that the numbers are absolutely shocking, just how many doctors were in Venezuela upon Chavez's death. There were literally thousands of like 32,000 Cubans in Venezuela, and they were helping people. They're professional. It's not like Cuba is just sticking a straw in Venezuela and just ripping them off, because Cuba has completely given something in return. That's called bartering. And since Cuba is sanctioned and they're cash strapped, they need to find these mechanisms to survive, because if you cripple a country, if you make them push them over to the edge, which is terrible, because you might you risk actually the Cuban Revolution going down a path of I would say a more authoritarian control, because then you justify a situation of exception and all that. But the sanctions right now in Cuba, and it's absolutely astonishing how Bolton wants to completely just limit us American citizens. Now we can only send our families $1,000 for 3 months, and Americans with 0 families over there, they're not even allowed to travel. So it's absolutely mind-boggling, because like Obama's approach was a much friendlier thing, because if the current administration would really want to pursue this ridiculous crusade against communism, a communism that doesn't exist, because no way in history have we ever had a communist country. Cuba has socialist programs. Cuba, to survive the sanctions, is turning more and more capitalist per day. So this whole Cold War vocabulary is totally out of place. And just to wrap it up, just to finish, it's absolutely irresponsible and cruel when you hear Bolton and Trump and all these people go on the media and just say that within that Cuban population, within those doctors that have operated thousands of Venezuelans, people who had zero access to health care despite having all the resources in that country, when they slander these doctors, these professionals, because there's such a thing as a socialist program meant to empower and help poor people around the world, they're basically inciting xenophobia. Now, my uncle was shot in Nicaragua just a couple of months ago, when in Nicaragua there was this uprising, and they just ended up saying on Twitter, telling people that it was time to just expel from the country every single doctor they found on site. And they irresponsibly said that all Cuban doctors in Nicaragua were actually Cuban government agents. So my uncle finds himself one day just sitting on his porch. Thank God that he moved after like an hour or something, because then the bullet went into his leg and not his chest, where they probably were aiming. Why did that happen? Because if you work up people's imagination, you'll bring out the worst in people. And then finally, just to wrap it up, see, I wrote ending, so nobody panic. That's already my ending. We need proposals that feed people while keeping them free and with dignity. But let's cultivate the moral high ground and evolve to go beyond conflicting ideologies. Because obviously we all have different interpretations of what's best for us. But I think we can talk. I think we can try and persuade each other, not just enforce it with US bombs. So we need to have a conversation between equals, whether they speak Spanish or English or not. And trying to persuade someone to look at things your way will always be a legitimate move. And if our government could help feed hungry children in Venezuela and Cuba without trampling on their sovereign right to self-determination, our standing in the world would greatly improve, because right now it's obviously to international observers that if you disagree ideologically with the Trump administration, you will be targeted for destruction. That's far from making America great. It's a doomed recipe destined to help China on her path to becoming the next superpower, because China is doing it so much better right now. And thank you all.